The morning light poured into Elijah's penthouse like molten gold, spilling across glass walls, kissing the edges of polished marble, and warming the air with a quiet promise of something new. Zahara stood barefoot by the window, one hand wrapped around a coffee mug that had gone cold, her gaze fixed on the endless stretch of city skyline. She wasn't watching the streets below. She was somewhere else entirely. Somewhere between yesterday's almost and today's uncertainty. She could still see his face when he opened that small velvet box, could still feel the weight of his voice when he'd said her name, could still remember how close she had been to saying yes, how close she had been to letting herself fall, all the way. But she had said not yet, and those two words still hung in the air between them like a thread neither was willing to cut. Behind her, there was the faint sound of footsteps on hardwood. Steady, unhurried, the kind of steps that always carried quiet command. His voice followed, low and smooth, the kind of tone that found its way under her skin without permission. You've been staring out that window for a long time, and you haven't touched your coffee. She didn't turn right away. She wanted to hold on to this moment, the moment before the air shifted again. I'm thinking, she said softly, her voice a little lower than usual, not hiding that she knew he was already watching her. When she finally looked over her shoulder, Elijah was leaning against the kitchen island. Grey sweats hung low on his hips. A black t-shirt clung to his chest and shoulders. His hair slightly mussed, as if he'd just run a hand through it. His eyes were steady, dark, unreadable, but softer than she was used to. That softness was dangerous. It could make her believe things she wasn't ready to believe yet. He took a step toward her, then another, moving with a deliberate calm. Every inch of space he closed, feeling heavier than the last. About yesterday, he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and something that sounded like restraint. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she met his gaze head-on. The way you face something that could undo you if you let it too close. Yes, she admitted, her voice low but certain. For a long heartbeat, nothing else existed. The city was a blur beyond the glass, the hum of traffic muted, the rest of the world locked out. He came closer until the air between them felt charged, until she could feel the faint warmth of his body reaching her before his touch did. His hand lifted slowly, fingers brushing her jaw, tilting her chin just enough so she was forced to see him really see him. Their lips were only a breath apart, and the moment swelled like the seconds before a storm. This wasn't a kiss. Not yet. This was an unspoken question, and the answer hung in the quickened rhythm of her breathing. Her pulse hammered in her ears. She could smell him cedarwood, faint citrus, the clean scent of his skin, and it made her want to close the final inch between them. To drown in the heat she could feel waiting just beyond the line they'd drawn. You don't have to answer now, he said quietly, his breath grazing her mouth, his eyes locked on hers with that steady, unblinking focus that made her forget every defense she'd ever built. But I want you to know, I'm still here. Zahara's heart clenched. She looked down at his mouth, then back to his eyes, fighting the urge to lean forward and erase the distance. Instead, she stepped back just slightly, feeling the air cool between them, even as her body ached to stay close. Then let's do something reckless, she said. Her voice steady, but laced with something that made his eyes narrow with interest. Reckless, he repeated, a slow smile tugging at his lips. Spend a day with me, she said. No talk about yesterday, no talk about tomorrow. No questions about what this is, just, right now. The smile on his face deepened, not just because of her words but because he could already see where this could lead. Careful, Zahara, he murmured, his tone dropping lower, the edges of his voice curling around her name like it belonged to him. A day with me might make you want forever. She didn't flinch, didn't look away. We'll see, she replied, and for the first time since yesterday, she felt the dangerous thrill of stepping into unknown territory, only this time she wasn't afraid of losing herself. By late morning, the penthouse door closed behind them, and the city air wrapped around Zahara like a pulse she hadn't felt in weeks. Elijah didn't ask where she wanted to go. He simply walked beside her, matching her pace, letting the silence stretch in a way that felt easy, not heavy. The streets were alive with sound vendors calling out over steaming carts, the rumble of passing buses, the soft notes of a street musician's saxophone drifting through the air. She didn't know if he was guiding her somewhere or if they were just letting the day choose for them, but somehow, they kept finding themselves drawn into the same small spaces, side by side, shoulders brushing in ways that lingered. The first stop was an old bookstore tucked between a cafe and a boutique. The air inside smelled like worn paper and rain-soaked wood. Zahara moved down the narrow aisles, fingers grazing the spines of hardcovers, her eyes catching on poetry collections and political biographies. Elijah followed quietly, watching her instead of the shelves. "You read the way some people breathe," he said when she paused, turning a book over in her hands. She glanced back, caught by the softness in his expression, and for a moment, she forgot she wasn't supposed to be falling for him. After the bookstore came a tiny jazz cafe, the kind where the light filtered in through lace curtains and the tables were close enough that knees brushed if you shifted too much. They sat in the corner, sharing a slice of lemon cake between them. When the singer on stage began a slow, honey-smooth rendition of a love song, Zahara felt his eyes on her, not in a way that asked for anything, but in a way that made her skin warm. She kept her gaze on her coffee, though her lips curved, just slightly aware of every second that passed under his attention. In the afternoon, they wandered down to the waterfront. The air was cooler here, the smell of salt and metal rising from the docks. She leaned against the railing, watching the water break against the pilings, while he stood beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, even through the breeze. A photographer weaving through the crowd stopped and asked if they could pose it. They looked interesting together. Zahara almost refused, but Elijah's hand found the small of her back, steady and warm, and she let the stranger snap the shot. She didn't think much of it until later, as the sun began to set. They found themselves at a small rooftop garden above an art gallery. Lanterns hung from strings, glowing against the deepening sky. They didn't talk much, just wandered the paths between the flowers, their shoulders brushing in the narrow walkways. Every so often, his hand would drift toward hers, never quite touching, but never far away either. By the time they were back in the SUV, the city lights were glittering against the night, and Zahara was leaning against the cool glass of the window, her reflection soft beside his. She realized she hadn't thought about Malik once today. She hadn't thought about what Elijah might want from her or where this was going. She had just been, and for someone who had been holding her breath for months, that felt dangerously close to freedom. When the driver turned onto Elijah's street, she glanced at him, expecting him to say something to break the quiet. But he only looked back at her, his gaze steady, his mouth curved in the faintest smile. Like he knew the day had done something neither of them would admit out loud just yet. The next morning, Zahara's phone buzzed just as she was stepping out of her apartment, and she almost ignored it until she saw the name flash across the screen. Malik. Her stomach tightened. She had deleted him from her contacts weeks ago, but some names you don't need saved to recognize. She let it ring out, but within minutes a text followed saying they needed to talk and that it was about Elijah. Her fingers hovered over the screen, and she told herself she wasn't replying yet. Somehow she typed back that she didn't need to hear anything from him. His reply came fast, telling her she didn't know Elijah the way she thought she did, that men like him didn't protect women, they owned them. She shoved her phone into her bag, irritated that he still had the power to try to plant seeds of doubt. But the words stuck in her mind longer than she wanted to admit. That evening, she met Elijah at a quiet upscale lounge he had chosen. He was already there when she arrived, seated at a corner table with his jacket draped over the chair beside him. The low lighting catching in the sharp lines of his face, giving nothing away about whether he was relaxed or calculating. The moment she approached, he told her she was tense. She said she was fine. His gaze sharpened and he told her someone had talked to her. She hesitated before admitting it was Malik. The air between them shifted instantly. His jaw tightened, and for the first time she saw something colder in him, more dangerous. He asked what Malik had said, and she told him bluntly that Malik claimed she didn't know him, that he was the kind of man who pretended to protect but was really controlling. She didn't soften it. Elijah leaned back, eyes steady on hers, and asked if she believed it. She said no too quickly, then added, in a quieter tone, not completely. His expression stayed unreadable, but his fingers drummed once against the table before stilling. He told her he didn't care what Malik thought of him, but he cared that Malik was trying to put thoughts in her head, and he told her to stay away from him. Something in the way he said it made her spine stiffen, and she told him she didn't need him deciding who she could and couldn't speak to. His jaw flexed again, and he said there was a difference between control and protection. She asked him if there really was. They stared at each other for a long moment, the lounge's background music fading under the weight of the tension. She wasn't sure if they were on the edge of a fight or something dangerously intimate. Then, Elijah leaned forward, his voice lower, and told her to come with him tomorrow for one night away from the city with no Malik, no noise, just them. She wanted to say no, to argue that running away from tension wasn't the answer. But the thought of leaving it all behind and being alone with him made her pulse skip in a way she didn't want to name. The following afternoon, the city was fading. Behind them, its steel and glass giving way to stretches of open road. Zahara sat in the passenger seat of Elijah's SUV. The low hum of the engine vibrating beneath her feet. The quiet between them, charged but unspoken. She had thrown a small overnight bag into the back without asking where they were going, letting Pangea take the lead even though part of her still bristled at how their last conversation ended. Outside the window, bare winter trees blurred past, and sunlight spilled across the dashboard in slow waves. After an hour of silence, Elijah, finally, spoke. He told her Malik wasn't wrong about one thing Elijah had been controlling in the past. He had been with people who needed direction, and he had given it, sometimes without asking if they wanted it, because that was the only way he knew how to keep them safe. He said it wasn't about ownership, it was about fear, and that fear had been with him long before she ever walked into that hotel bar. Zahara listened quietly, her hands in her lap, unsure if she was ready to forgive him for assuming she needed the same treatment. When they reached the coast, the air was sharper, and the horizon was a strip of deep blue against the pale sky. The cabin Elijah had chosen stood just above the waterline, all glass walls and cedar beams, with the sound of waves breaking below. Inside, it smelled faintly of wood smoke and salt, and the quiet was thick enough to hear their breathing. She walked to the wide glass window that overlooked the ocean while he set their bags down. The water churned below, restless and endless, and for some reason it felt like a reflection of what was moving inside her. He came to stand beside her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his body against her shoulder. He said she was still angry with him. She told him she was still deciding. His hand brushed her arm as he turned her to face him, his gaze steady but not demanding. He asked her to believe that every decision he made around her came from wanting her safe, not small. She told him wanting her safe didn't mean deciding for her, that she needed to stand in her own life without someone else holding the map. The words sat between them, heavier than the sound of the waves. She thought he might argue, but instead he reached for her hand, not to pull her closer, but to hold it loosely, as though giving her the choice to step back if she wanted. She didn't. The moment stretched until she could feel her pulse in her fingertips, until she was aware of the way his eyes lingered on her mouth. The tension was sharp enough to cut, and for a second, she wondered if either of them would speak again, or if the next move would be something they couldn't undo. Elijah finally let her hand go and stepped back, telling her there was food in the kitchen and that he'd start a fire. It should have been an ordinary moment, but the restraint in it left her unsteady, because she realized the only thing more dangerous than him wanting to control her was him learning to hold back. Fire was already crackling by the time Zahara came back from exploring the cabin. She found Elijah in the kitchen, sleeves pushed up, slicing vegetables with a precision that looked more like habit than skill. The scent of garlic and rosemary filled the space, and for a moment she just leaned against the doorway, watching him. It was strange seeing a man who commanded boardrooms moving around a kitchen like this, barefoot, quiet, focused on the rhythm of the knife against the cutting board. When he noticed her, his eyes softened. He asked if she wanted wine or tea. She said wine, and he poured it without comment, handing her the glass before returning to the stove. She stepped closer, close enough to feel the warmth coming off him. Close enough that her shoulder brushed his arm when she reached for the salt. He didn't move away, neither did she. They ate at the small table near the fire, the glow from the flames turning the edges of his face golden. He told her stories from before she met him, not the polished anecdotes that made for good interviews, but raw pieces of his life, including nights when success felt like a cage and mornings when he woke up wondering if the walls he'd built were keeping the wrong things out. She listened, feeling the shape of the man behind the name, the one Malik couldn't possibly understand. After dinner, they moved to the couch, a heavy wool blanket draped across their legs, the fire painting the room in shades of amber. While they just sat there, listening to the ocean through the glass walls, watching the shadows move across the floor. His arm rested along the back of the couch, not quite touching her, but close enough that she felt the warmth radiating between them. He asked her about her earliest memory of feeling safe, and she told him about sitting on the porch of her grandmother's house during summer storms, wrapped in a blanket while rain hammered the tin roof. She admitted she hadn't felt that kind of safe in years. His gaze lingered on her face as if he was memorizing every word. He said he wanted to change that, but not by standing over her, by standing with her. The way he said it shifted something inside her, loosening knots she hadn't realized she was holding. She leaned back just slightly, her head brushing his shoulder. He didn't react at first, as if waiting to see if she'd pull away. When she didn't, his hand found hers under the blanket, his fingers warm, his grip loose but certain. They stayed like that until the fire burned low, their bodies angled toward each other, not speaking, not needing to. She realized then that maybe intimacy wasn't always about possession or control. Sometimes it was simply about being seen, and still being chosen. By the time they returned to the city, the quiet of the cabin still clung to Zahara like a second skin. She hadn't realized how much she'd needed that kind of stillness until it was gone, replaced by the familiar hum of traffic and the sharp gleam of glass towers. 2 days later, Elijah sent a message telling her to keep Saturday night free. He didn't explain why, only that she should wear something she felt beautiful in. When the black SUV pulled up in front of her building that evening, she was dressed in a floor-length gown of deep emerald silk that traced her shape without clinging too much. Her curls swept into a loose, elegant style. Elijah stepped out as the driver opened the door for her. He was in a perfectly tailored black suit, the kind that turned heads without effort. His gaze swept over her once, slow and deliberate, and for a moment the world outside the car seemed to fade. They arrived at a private rooftop ballroom glowing under strings of golden lights. Waiters moved like shadows between clusters of guests in gowns and tuxedos, the air buzzing with the low hum of powerful conversations. It was a political gala hosted by one of her mentor's colleagues, and she quickly realized Elijah knew far more people here than she did. The moment they stepped inside, eyes followed them, some curious, some calculating, some openly appraising. Elijah's hand rested lightly at the small of her back as he guided her through the room. It was a simple touch, but it anchored her. In the swirl of introductions and champagne flutes, she noticed how he shifted subtly whenever another man leaned too far into her space, positioning himself just close enough to make his presence felt without interrupting. It should have felt possessive, but somehow it didn't. Not tonight. At one point, her mentor, Dr. Reed, appeared with a warm smile, introducing her to a group of influential academics and political figures. Elijah hung back, letting her own voice carry in the conversation, his eyes steady on her as if he was quietly memorizing the way she came alive when speaking about her work. She realized then that this was what it looked like when someone allowed her to stand in her own light. Later, when a slow jazz number began, Elijah extended his hand without a word, She hesitated for only a heartbeat before placing hers in his, and he drew her into the center of the dance floor. The rest of the room blurred as his hands settled at her waist, and her other hand found his shoulder. They moved in quiet synchrony, their bodies close but not pressed. Their eyes locked as though the music existed only for them. When the song ended, he didn't let go right away. Instead, his thumb brushed the back of her hand as he leaned closer, his voice low enough for only her to hear. He told her she looked like she belonged here, not because of the dress or the way people watched her, but because she carried herself like someone who knew exactly who she was. She felt the heat rise in her chest, not from the compliment itself, but from the fact that he meant it. The ride back was quiet, but it wasn't an empty silence. In the shadowed interior of the SUV, she could still feel the echo of his hand at her back, the weight of his gaze on the dance floor, and the way being beside him tonight hadn't made her feel smaller, it had made her feel more herself. The morning after the gala, Zahara's phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, she thought it was just her friends asking how the night went, but when she finally opened her messages, she saw the link. A glossy online magazine had posted a photo from the event, her in the emerald gown, Elijah beside her in black, their bodies angled toward each other, a shared smile caught in mid-motion. The headline called her the mystery woman on Elijah Braxton's arm, and the article speculated about who she was, how they met, and whether she was the reason he had been seen less at industry events in recent months. Her social media flooded with tags and friend requests from strangers. Friends from college sent teasing messages, half impressed and half nosy, while a few acquaintances made thinly veiled comments about her upgrading her life. Even her mother left a voice message saying she'd seen the article, her tone a mix of curiosity and caution. At first, Zahara wanted to brush it off, but as the day went on, she felt the weight of it settling in. Being with Elijah in private was one thing. Being part of his public world was something else entirely. She couldn't ignore how many people now had opinions about her without knowing her at all. By late afternoon, Elijah called. His tone was casual at first, asking if she'd eaten, if she was free that evening. But when she mentioned the article, he admitted he'd seen it before she had. He told her it didn't matter what people said, that she shouldn't waste energy worrying about opinions that didn't touch their reality. She wanted to believe him, but there was something in his voice that made her wonder if it was that simple. She asked if being photographed with her was a problem for him. He told her it wasn't, but he also said they needed to be ready for more of it. In his world, once people started watching, they didn't stop. That night, she sat in her apartment, scrolling through the comments under the article. Most were harmless, but a few were sharp, questioning her intentions, her background, even her worth. She closed her phone, leaning back against the couch, trying to decide if she was ready for this kind of attention, not just the pretty photographs and the glamorous settings, but the scrutiny that came with standing next to a man like Elijah Braxton. When her phone buzzed again, it was a simple message from him: dinner, tomorrow, my place, we talk. There was no question mark, just a statement. And even though part of her bristled at the decisiveness, another part of her wanted to hear what he had to say. The next evening, Zahara stood outside Elijah's penthouse door, the city lights glittering behind her through the glass of the building's lobby. When he opened the door, he was dressed simply: dark jeans, a fitted black sweater, barefoot, no trace of the sharp suit armor he wore in public. The air inside smelled faintly of cedarwood and something richer, like slow-cooked herbs. Dinner was already on the table, lit by the soft glow of candles. But the moment she stepped in, she knew this night wasn't really about food. He poured her a glass of wine, and they ate quietly at first. The clink of silverware against porcelain, the only sound between them. When the plates were cleared, he didn't lead her to the couch or the balcony. Instead, he stood at the head of the table, his hands braced on the wood, his gaze fixed on hers. He told her there was something she needed to understand about him. His voice was calm, but there was an edge to it, the kind that comes from holding a story for too long. He said when he was younger, he had a sister Eva. She was bright, fearless, and trusted people to isolate. One night, she met someone she'd thought she could believe in, that man took advantage of her trust and pulled her into a situation she couldn't escape. Elijah found out too late. By the time he could help her, she was already gone. He never saw her alive again. Zahara didn't move. She felt the words settle between them, heavy and irreversible. He said that losing her was the reason he had built his life the way he had. Why he kept walls so high. Why he stepped in when he thought someone he cared about was at risk. He told her he knew it wasn't fair to put those fears onto her. But every time she walked into a room without him, a part of him pictured the worst. She stood slowly, moving around the table, until she was in front of him. She told him she understood now, that his protectiveness came from grief, not arrogance. But she also told him she couldn't let his past become the map for her future. If they were going to be anything real, she needed him to trust that she could protect herself too. He nodded, but the look in his eyes was more complicated than agreement. He reached for her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles, his grip warm and firm. He told her he didn't want to change who she was, he just didn't know how to stop seeing danger in every shadow. In that moment, she realized something about Elijah Braxton. He wasn't asking her to let him lead. He was asking her to let him try to learn how to walk beside her. And that, maybe, was a beginning. They left the city before dawn on Friday, the streets still slick from the night's rain, the air holding the kind of quiet that only exists when the world hasn't fully woken up. Elijah didn't tell her the destination, only that he wanted her to see a place where the noise couldn't follow them. The SUV hummed along the winding coastal roads, the sky slowly lightening from charcoal to pale gold. Zahara sat in the passenger seat, legs curled under her, watching the horizon open into stretches of water and jagged cliffs. By mid-morning, they reached a private cabin perched on the edge of a quiet bay. The structure was modern but warm glass walls looking out over the water. A deck with a single hammock swaying in the salt wind, and the distant sound of gulls calling over the waves. Inside, sunlight spilled across wide planked floors and shelves stacked with old books. She walked through each room slowly, letting herself breathe in the stillness, feeling the tension of the city dissolve from her shoulders. They spent the first afternoon wandering the shore barefoot, the cool water brushing over their toes as they walked. Elijah carried their shoes without comment, his free hand brushing hers from time to time, as if testing the space between them. When the wind picked up, she wrapped her cardigan tighter, and without asking, he draped his jacket over her shoulders. She didn't thank him out loud, she just met his gaze and let the look say what words didn't need to. That night, they cooked together in the open kitchen, moving easily around each other, trading small smiles and quick glances as though they'd been doing this for years. Music played low from a speaker, the kind of soft instrumental that blurred into the sound of the waves beyond the glass. After dinner, they carried their wine to the deck, watching the moonlight scatter across the water. When she shivered, he moved closer, his arm brushing hers, the heat of him chasing away the chill. He told her that moments like this made him wish life could stay this simple. She told him maybe it could, if they chose it. His eyes searched hers in the low light, and for the first time in weeks, there was no push, no pull, no contest of control. Just a quiet understanding that whatever they were building here belonged to both of them equally. Later, when they went inside, they didn't talk about where they would sleep. It happened naturally, his hand finding hers as they moved through the dim cabin, the shared awareness in the way they closed the bedroom door behind them. The night unfolded in unhurried movements, every touch and glance deliberate, neither of them trying to lead or follow, both meeting in the middle. When morning came, they were still tangled together under the pale light, the sound of the tide rising outside. She felt the steady rhythm of his breathing, and realized this was the first time she'd woken beside him without any weight in her chest and a fear of losing herself. No question about where she stood. This wasn't surrender. This was choice. They drove back to the city on Sunday evening, the roads slick with the shimmer of an earlier rain. The quiet in the SUV felt different this time. Not the sharp silence of unspoken arguments, but the easy kind that follows a weekend spent in. Zahara leaned her head against the window, watching the glow of the skyline grow brighter as they got closer. She wasn't thinking about Malik, or the article, or the doubts that had once made her second-guess every step with Elijah. She was thinking about how it felt to walk beside him on the shore, to laugh in the kitchen, to fall asleep without feeling the need to guard herself. When they reached his building, she followed him upstairs without needing to ask why. The penthouse. Lights were low, the city stretched out beneath them like an endless constellation. He set his bag down, disappeared into his study for a moment, and came back holding something in his hand. It wasn't a ring box this time. It was a single silver key on a black leather fob. He didn't make a speech. He simply stepped close enough that she could feel the heat from his body, and said, "This isn't a promise you didn't ask for. It's not a question you're not ready to answer. It's an open door, for when you want it." She looked down at the key resting in his palm, then back at him. "And if I never use it?" she asked, her voice steady but softer than she intended. "Then it stays here," he said. "No pressure, no expiration." She took it, not because she was ready to move in, but because she understood what it meant. It wasn't control, it wasn't a claim. It was a gesture that said he was willing to meet her where she stood. They ended up on the balcony, the wind carrying the faint hum of the city below. His hand found hers, fingers weaving through without hesitation. They stood like that, looking out at the lights, not talking about what came next. They didn't need to. For the first time since the night they met, the future didn't feel like a negotiation. It felt like something they could choose together, when they were ready.